Jamie, thank you very much for joining me on the What is a Good Life podcast today. Since becoming aware of your work through a previous guest of mine and finding out more about your work, I've been really looking forward to seeing where this conversation goes today.
Yeah, me too. Me too. Really, Mark, I really appreciate this sort of inquiry that you've been on for over 100 episodes now. And yeah, deeply honored to be part of it.
So, as you're aware, the question that I kick this off with is there a question you're exploring as you move through life?
Yeah, I love this starter question. And it's a way I've actually introduced myself in the past. I've written sort of bios as I in that frame, as in my animating question is, what am I practicing, or what are we practicing? And that question came out initially, I think, in fact, I know, of personal suffering, of realizing that I didn't like myself and I wasn't making myself happy. And that in some ways I was reinforcing or practicing the wrong things that were taking me, um, in the wrong direction, and into greater suffering. And that insight made me think, well, what could I be practicing instead? Like, what could I be bringing into my life intentionally? And it was that inquiry about that intentional layer, um, of cultivation of growth, which helped me to find what I was looking for, which was to feel a bit better, um, have better well-being, feel a bit better about myself. And then, as I felt good enough, the question then became, how can I help? You know, how can I help the world ask a similar question? Because those things that I then adopted over time weren't widely known about. This is well before the mindfulness revolution, or this headspace became a thing, and certainly it wasn't a mainstream pastime, to have a daily practice. And obviously my background inclines me towards thinking about meditation and things like that. But there are many things we can be doing on a daily basis or informally throughout life, and so I've managed to find a professional niche, like a role in the world, where I have been asking that question at a policy level and trying to work out how this can be, a focus of our civilization, of our society, like thinking more deeply about what the purpose of human endeavor is, and making that not just about external progress, technical, material progress, but progress in hearts and minds and culture that requires us to be a bit more intentional about who we are and what we're doing. Yeah, I think that's
This is
what I want to say.
this is a gorgeous opening, and the so many things I'm curious about. I guess even the initial realization of realizing that I don't like myself very much at a certain point in time. Something
Mm.
something strongly resident. Um, and I guess also the idea, though, I think that comes from anyone's personal journey where something starts to be felt, like even the noting of not just trying to fixate on outcomes, but how do we feel in our hearts and minds? How might that affect the culture? But this awareness from going through your own process of then what maybe the world needs. Um, just from your perspective, would you mind just elaborating a little bit on your process, on your experience, I guess, into that sense of feeling a little bit better, and then it becoming a little bit more of an outward looking inquiry, I guess.
Mm. Mm. Yeah. Yeah. So again, I'll give an example of realizing I had bad habits around litter. Like I would, like many kids coming out of school, eat a packet of crisps I picked up at the corner shop, and drop it on the floor. And now I look at that incomprehensively. I'm just like, incomprehendingly, how can you do that? Have so little care? But then I have to remind myself that's exactly how you behaved. And there was a moment which I realized I don't want to be that guy. I had some inkling that this was out of alignment. It wasn't a shoulding on behalf of society. It was more like, this causes me some kind of discomfort, some kind of pain. But it took quite a long time for me to stop doing it. So I'd drop it, I'd walk on a few paces, I'd start to notice I was feeling bad about that. But 20 meters back or whatever is too far to now turn around. But then I caught myself sooner and sooner until it was just like, oh, it's only a few paces, and now I'll turn around and I'll pick it up, And then eventually, I don't throw it on the floor at all, but I almost did. And then it becomes habit to, put it in the bin. And that required acknowledging I wasn't totally in control of my own behavior, that there were habits that were conditioned by whatever environmental or, habitual tendencies. And I had to go against the stream and overcome that. and that same kind of that kind of paradigm of going against the stream and seeing that we're doing things that are, polluting or, damaging us, but it's like we have all this inertia in the direction of bad habits, and it requires conscious will to change those. It was kind of in the service of my own well-being, like I wanted that deeper harmony, alignment, and not to, like I say, dislike myself. And this is one of the things that gives me hope about human nature or our predicament, is that it was that same desire that led me into service and to thinking about how I could make things better for other people, because it just feels good.
Yeah.
Like I don't want to be too universalizing around this. There are psychopaths and sociopaths and people who have all kinds of different brains, right? But on the whole, and if you go to the wisdom traditions like Buddhism, they're quite cynical, really, about our inherent fallenness on one level. In the Buddhist frame, it's greed, hatred, delusion. These things are pretty much baked in, or at least soft-wired, and we have to really work hard to unpick them. But we are ultimately redeemable. And one of the things that drives us in that direction is it just feels good. One of the first things that gets taught is generosity, because it's so transformative to realize, like, there's a releasing of my heart. There's a less contraction in my being as I just, even if it's mechanical initially, and I'm doing it to make the monk feel, because I was told to do it, and I want him to think I'm a good person. But then you do it, and you're like, actually, something releases, and I guess I felt that little by little. I was just like, I was given a school's career test. I remember when I was in teenage years, and they gave me like lines, and the thicker the line on the branching of a tree, the more likely it is you should go down that path, And there was like a care branch, and it was just the thinnest, most withered branch. Like it wasn't on paper, having answered this survey, something that motivated me at all. Like go and be a doctor or go and be an aid worker or whatever. It just, and so. And so, yeah, admittedly, it wasn't a strong, at least conscious impulse then. But like little by little, I think I saw that, my well-being, my health, the health and well-being of others, and the planet were inextricably linked, even just in that phenomenological way, just in a self-serving way. Um, and and of course, I've spent the last 15 years looking at how it's inextricably linked in all these other ways that we can talk to policymakers about, and why it makes sort of like total logical rational sense to invest in both parts of this sort of human system, all parts of this human system. Um, so so yeah, that was the kind of movement, I guess. Just a little bit of trial and error, a little bit of testing, and a little bit of faith creeping in little by little. Like so much of my path has been like that, like meditation, like give it 5 minutes, 10 minutes, a few times a week. And then little by little, like, the days I do that, I make fewer mistakes. I'm less of an asshole. Things are a bit easier, likely to go well. But the commitment you need to do deep practice, hour plus a day, for me anyway, took years of incremental faith building.
There's a lovely, I think, sentiment of, just realizing that it's not. We often think of goodness, right? I think we probably have some hangover from how we're raised or something. That if you do X, Y, or Z, you're a good boy or a good girl, and when you do that, you're going to make people smile or get approval. But I think there's something about when you start paying deep attention to your own life, that there's a subtlety that develops. And you've mentioned opening of the heart, and I feel it in my heart, wherever that exists within me, that it really isn't about anyone else. It's in the sense of just how I experience that. I feel it very clearly in my heart when I'm doing what I perceive to be something that feels right, like that. And right and wrong sounds so misplaced when discussing this, because it almost feels more like a knowing of something that feels very free from judgment or even many mental structures. But I think that that's something that is a really beautiful thing if somebody comes into contact with it. From your experience of that, like, what did you start to notice, or even what were the kind of initial inclinations? And this can be in any phase of your life or any area of it, if you know what I mean. But because I felt there's a real subtlety, but a real importance to that.
Yeah. 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 The path, in many ways, I mean, there are many domains of development, and I think this is true for many of them, that they happen little by little, then all at once.
Yeah.
And it's like sometimes, like the petals of a flower, like there's one sticky petal that stops all the others popping open, and then there needs to be a change or a realization that happens in that domain. And so, yeah, like I said, there's this everyday faith building and trial and error, and then sometimes you find something that's just like, oh, that was such a key here. And for the, maybe I spent 5 years having learned meditation, just doing it now and again, for the interest, and then I spent another maybe similar amount of time practicing and being more and more dedicated to practice, because I realized, hey, it helped me with my kind of ADD type symptoms, working in advertising, trying to work longer hours, make better commercials for SUVs, but living quite out of alignment with not having the right livelihood, and so finding a way in which I could be professionally engaged, and allowed me to sort of go with the grain of the rest of my orientation and my life and my efforts, was one of those moments that kind of popped open. and I got to a quite different place, and that made me. That was the moment, I guess, at which my personal practice and well-being and wanting to be nice to people became a kind of whole life path of like um, of of service. I don't know whether I'm really answering your question, but
Oh,
that's where
you've
my mind
actually,
went.
yeah, but you've touched on something that I think is really important. And once again, I'm not looking to speak on behalf of humanity. As you've said, there's many different brains, many different experiences of this life.
Mm,
For me, that coming more into my work being an expression of that, or even a continuation of that inquiry.
mm,
And I've mentioned on several podcasts, like I haven't figured this out from a sustainable livelihood, if you know what I mean. It's been an interesting path. I used to work in finance, so
mm,
it's been really interesting for me in terms of just navigating this and getting more clarity as I go through it. But definitely, it's still a process. With this, though, there's something about this for me which, until it is that, there's a couple of phases that, or a couple of occurrences that I think have happened for me, which is one, it's no longer just about that, whether it's a practice in the morning, a practice in the evening with meditation, and then just doing whatever you kind of doing whatever you please in between.
mm, mm,
um then it's like a more of a paying attention to the world outside of me, whether that's nature, other people, contact with humans, like even just a more consistent shared sense of humanity.
mm.
And then this piece that you're mentioning here about work, and I don't know where this fits in because, so many people don't have a choice about work. And
Yes.
there's different layers to that too. Like, do I not have a choice because I want to maintain a really nice lifestyle? Do I not have a choice just because of the hardship of economic
Yeah.
realities?
Absolutely. Yeah.
But wherever anyone is in relation to that, that is their relationship. So it's not about a judgment of that.
Mm,
And I find it so powerful, though, when you can find an outlet for some of this inquiry or this heart-based experience of life, then. Because I don't know about you, when you were mentioning even just the working with with ads and whatever else, there's something that feels really jerky about our first steps into this path, because it's could be very solemn in our own practice or in retreats, and then we're back into this madness of the world that's
mhm.
contributing to it.
Yes.
And that's a very difficult path to maintain, I think, because I think something
Yeah.
in it feels even a little bit more split at the beginning of that.
Yes, absolutely. And it's, yeah, for those reasons, one of the hardest parts of the path and the easiest to get lost. So many people start, they go on a Vipassana retreat. They say, I can see now, and I can see clearly now. And then if you don't practice your insights, you lose them. And if you're, it's like they say that, habits, good and bad, are infectious. So if you want to stop smoking, if you want to do more reading or whatever, the best thing you can do is hang out with people who don't smoke or read
Right.
lots of books. Like, and but it's very difficult to do that, and it's probably not advised to completely like change your life after a single Vipassana retreat. Um, but it is, you are going against the stream, and you do need to build in those things into your life, friends on the path, habits. And for me, I developed like a prayer that I wrote my own prayer, and I would say it every morning as I realized that actually I really want to be what I started calling at that time a kind of like a spiritual warrior. Like, I wanted to develop myself on the path, and I wanted to find a livelihood that, where I could contribute. And yeah, I would frequently get lost. I'd frequently go, um, I don't know. I used to party a lot in my late 20s, and that often would be what would send me off in a different direction. But one of the things from what you said, I think is absolutely key, is this difference between informal and formal practice, and also the difference between really thinking, what am I practicing? What am I wanting to call into my life and to cultivate, and making that the primary project? Or am I consuming meditations and yoga class is like another consumer product. That they're being done to me. I show up. I'm paying for somebody else's will and instruction to basically, I'll follow your instructions and I'll do what you say. And then at the end of the class, I feel more relaxed. My body feels looser. Or I listen to a guided meditation and I kind of, I've paid my subscription for the month and this is the 15 minutes I paid for and I'm feeling better afterwards. And that I think is less powerful than even no meditation, but a deep informal inquiry, moment to moment, of trying to usher certain things into your life. And you mentioned good and bad, and not sure that's kind of the right frame. I agree, and there's a famous Rumi poem that talks about like there is a field beyond wrongdoing and like wrong making and right making is the translation that I like. This kind of like good and badding of reality, but attuning instead to wholesome and unwholesome, which has a slightly different quality. It's less kind of rigid, less judgmental. It's a bit fuzzier. It might just be me for the that has this sort of like difference in language here, but like a deep inquiry about how can I move towards wholesome and away from unwholesome at the level of one's being is much more transformative than pressing play on a recording, even on a daily basis. Do that, and that's one of the reasons why I think moving from listening to guided meditations to really imbibing it, what's the word? Like making it your own, and doing it in silence is quite a different thing as well. Yeah.
There's something really beautiful to just that opening question and just what you repeated there again of just what am I practicing, and the discerning of the significance as well of the informal practice. Like there's something really quite unrealistic, I think, about some of our expectations. I talked to someone recently where they said so much of how we use mindfulness is more from a self-optimization perspective rather than like a regenerative kind of approach to life, or this movement, as you say, even towards more wholesomeness. Like it's really, for anyone listening, it's really not a sense of, even when I do something more wholesome, that I'm patting myself on the back. It's just a felt sense or a noticing in the moment of my engagement or the feedback that life is offering me. And life isn't offering any words with it. It's just like it's almost like an energy to be felt. From your perspective then, just how, when you became more kind of tuned into, okay, this is part of my path now. This, even I love the expression of spiritual warrior as well. What energy did that kind of build for you? And you mentioned intention earlier as well. How did even the kind of work that you're doing now come to be? And yeah, wherever it goes from there.
There's a phrase I love actually that a teacher, like a Dharma teacher colleague of mine, uses about it all resting on the tip of intention. And one's life, I think, can be said to be all resting on the tip of intention. And the honing of my intention, like we are not totally in control of intention. That's actually one of the things you learn, like on meditation retreat, like doing walking meditation, like it's rather than just sitting and closing your eyes and staying still, you're actually playing with this sense of like being active in the world and noticing where that intention to stop, to turn, to move back in this sort of often a kind of formalized line that you're walking on. And you start to see how intention arises almost like a cloud passes. It's not totally under my control. And you see the bubbling up and arising of tension, intentions coming and going. And then you have a kind of meta relationship with those intentions, where again, you're like, oh, well, there's a wholesome intention there. I'll sort of like try and raise that up. and reinforce that one. There's an unwholesome intention. There's a meanness. There's a closeness. There's a selfishness there, and I'll accept that, because that's healthy. That's or I'm not saying the meanness is healthy, but it's healthy to accept it and to work with it at that level. And so, in the same way, in the kind of microcosm on retreat, in the moment to moment, you also do that in your life through working practice. It's just like, there's an intention actually to want to copyright that, for that idea to be mine, so I can be this flag waving hero who goes like, look at me creating positive change in the world. And you're like, oh, actually the intention there isn't quite wholesome, is it? I mean, no one else has noticed, but I don't think. But and in a different moment, there's this like generosity of spirit where you're just like, and it's not to say that copywriting is always unskillful. Don't get me wrong. Sometimes it's good to hold ground and boundaries and but like, what's the intention there? That's the key thing. And it's that awakeness. We have a tendency to fall back asleep. Society is giving us many ways to do that. I don't need to mention them, but the media landscape, technology, etc. Don't get me wrong. I like my games and TV as much as the next guy, but it definitely has a soma, dulling quality if you, depending on the way you consume it, and so there's a constant waking up and falling back to sleep again, like oscillating and hopefully getting more awake over the time, and using, when you have those awake, more alert oscillations, you can catch those intentions and cultivate them. So there's that macro and micro mirroring each other there, I think. And so just a little bit kind of like work sketch perhaps of the last 15 years or so. I worked for a climate campaign, got disillusioned for one reason or another, that the information deficit hypothesis was going to shift anything. Like we tell people, we're rational agents, right? Homo economicus will do what is good for us. And I said, why did I go from working in advertising to working in a climate campaign? Well, it's because of my inner journey. The same facts landed differently, or rather, I actually at one point decided to turn towards the facts and go like, okay, well, it's time to really figure this out and learn about this now, in a way that I never would have done, like if I hadn't have been practicing the intentions to turn towards the difficult and be accepting of difficult things, on the cushion. And then through that was just, eventually kind of was working in the right sort of direction when I got a job at Headspace. I was sort of business development director in the early days when there's only about 10 people. Now there's sort of 200 or 300 based in California. And then through that got invited into a new parliamentary initiative in the UK Parliament, where politicians have been meditating for 18 months already. They've been taught mindfulness by the Oxford Mindfulness Centre, having been invited in by a member of Parliament and a member of the House of Lords. And I was one of the volunteers and experts who showed up to help them think about how mindfulness could have a place in public policy, how health, education, workplace, etc., could make better use of these emerging evidence-based practices. And then after that, I went more into I became a policy guy, basically. The only mindfulness policy guy, as far as I knew, in the world for about 5 or 6 years. And then other people started doing similar work. And then more recently worked for the Inner Development Goals, which is a great initiative looking at a whole range of things that we could do to be more equal to the challenges that we face collectively. It's kind of linked to the Sustainable Development Goals and backed by a couple of UN agencies. And now more broadly, just thinking about the polycrisis and connecting inner and outer, and thinking about, one of our recent papers is called The System Within. So it's basically, we tend to look at our external systems, our power lines, our politics, at least our structural stuff that we can sort of see and talk about as the main arena for intervention and progress. but we completely miss, for various cultural and philosophical reasons, this inner psychological cultural stuff and integrating those two, right? So it was a great luck that I got to talk about mindfulness as my day job. And that was amazing because, I was trying to be more and more awake and aware and compassionate and receptive personally. And now I could be reminded of it all day. And I think it doesn't have to be working in the field of inner development or
Yeah.
mindfulness, but is there something which, keeps bringing the drumbeat that keeps bringing you back to, what is it that I'm practicing? And at least that was it. That was it for me. Yeah.
It's remarkable the journeys that some people take when they open themselves up to some of these things. Like, the expression used earlier of faith, even in just, well, if I give this practice 5 minutes or 10 minutes, what will happen, and it developing from there. Have you had moments where you're like, how have I ended up here? Or because even as you allude to there, like roles appearing that hadn't appeared before, like
Mm.
do you have you reflected on this journey much and kind of gone, wow, this is interesting?
Yeah, I mean that absolutely. I read a book called Synchronicity back in like the late noughties, I think it was. Um, that's where I first came across this idea of like when you're operating from a certain place, weird stuff happens. Things unlock, and there are various ways you can explain this away, and that the kind of the open people are attracted to openness and the freedom that comes with that, soul position, psychological position, however you want to frame it. That you're more perspective, you notice things more, like chance happens, like luck happens when you're in that mode. And I'm open to also weirder explanations, but certainly the more faith I have given, not just to the practice, but to this case of I know some people say letting go, letting God, like letting something move through me that is not my own, that is transpersonal or something. I I hold different ontological possibilities in a kind of in superposition with each other without collapsing to one definite way of understanding all this, which I guess is the mystical position of just not knowing and having humility around like understanding the bonkersness of this being. But the more I have let go and let God, if that's your
Yeah.
language, the the more amazing things have happened. Like I found myself working with the White House. I'm having lunch with Goldie Hawn. I'm working in Parliament with politicians. I'm going traveling to amazing places. Like this is. Yeah, and I had friends and just been like, at the same time as suffering a great deal, like not getting funded properly, burning out, like feeling perhaps overly a sense of how important my work was. I
Right.
now have much sort of looser and more playful, easeful sense around it, but I thought it was so important what I was doing at certain times, Um, and also playing with like this not being my project, this being a project moving through me, or I guess that was a shift from a hero, very invested in its own efforts and successes and failures, to being much more about this emergent phenomena, and it's A, much more pleasant to be involved, and B, in my experience anyway, things unlock and it gets weirder still, the more that you have that faith. So I have had a very, very charmed time. I've been working in various ways with, Oxford University, doing, collaborations, teaching a bit, working with professors there, working with governments around the world. I couldn't have sketched a more exciting journey 10 years ago. And yet I don't feel very responsible for that, in a beautiful way, or rather, it's not quite true. It's like there is a place for agency, It's like one of my teachers talks about needing to have a new verb that's like creating and discovering at the same time. There is
Mm.
a little bit of you, and there's a little bit of like something else coming to meet that, which and it's in that interplay that the magic happens.
But this is a beautiful inquiry, though, even when you mention the act of walking up and down the same path and becoming aware or present to intention arising. And that very, it's hard to explain, I think, but it's very clearly felt. And you've touched on it a little bit more here almost the when that ours becomes mine. Um, and, even the idea that I am doing very important work, or even the hero in the story,
Hmm.
and what, like, maybe what that can create in terms of, like, stress or tension, and then a
Hmm.
playfulness arising. How have you just, and I'm asking you some questions, by the way, that aren't just basic yes or no answers. So I appreciate you just playing along with them and answering them as you have. But that sense of how would you even describe that balance or that dance? Because it's not to deny the fact that we exist in these separate bodies or avatars. That, look, people call me Mark and I identify with that, and people call you Jamie, and on some level you identify with that. There's some balance where it's not denying whatever your individual talents may be. It's not some fake humility, while it's also an acute awareness that, maybe we couldn't have mapped out the paths that we're on for anyone's life, and that there is at least a collaboration going on with life, that I'm not imposing something on life.
Hmm.
I think this is a really subtle and beautiful thing you're pointing to, in terms of it does in ways feel like riding a wave and how that can go.
Hmm.
Just so from your perspective, how have you kind of noticed where it feels like it's a collaboration, I guess, or a co-creation, versus it's too much of one or the other?
Mm. Yeah. Yeah. And this is such a fundamental question. And um, some philosophers have called these necessary contradictions or antinomies.
Right.
So Kant talks about this. Schleiermacher, is it? Um, and I most recently saw this written in McGilchrist's The Matter with Things, um, where the view where we have agency and free will, and the view that we are dependent on causes and conditions, um, neither of them are wholly right. And the nature of reality is a transcendent thing that both kind of point to. That you have to hold both in superposition, and this is one of the ways in which human thought and culture, I think, is getting more complex and able to hold some of this stuff. Is that we have this almost quantum language of superposition states, that things haven't got to be one or the other. Actually, we can hold both of those in our logos and in our hearts, and that necessary contradiction and antinomy is seen on the political spectrum. I think the right tends to look at it in terms of like personal choice, sovereignty, agency, and the left tends to look at, like, all the causes and conditions that led to the crime or led to the situation or whatever, and the right feels that is too forgiving or whatever. And actually, you do need to talk about personal responsibility and agency, and that we also need to say that nobody's an island and there are reasons why this person is acting like that. And can we hold both of those things? And again, it's true at the micro in one's own life. Can we? And by the way, we tend to look at the causes and conditions for our own failures and give people agency and responsibility for other people's failures. And there's a very well known about bias where we have this sort of like double standard, right? That serves our purposes for
It, it,
identity, but
It reminds me of when I used to work in finance, how there'd be brokers or portfolio managers that when the markets were down, people would just bemoan the markets. But when they
Yes,
were up, nobody said that they were making profits just because the markets were up.
right, exactly. It's because of their incredible intellect and decision-making prowess. Yeah, absolutely. And so yeah, I don't think that one is right. I think we probably, on the whole, need a corrective towards the more systemic and the more conditional. But that people in some of the worlds that I work in, I think, are too often sometimes go too far down that way. Now, the analogy, the image that I find most helpful for contemplating the nature of a human being, nature of existence, and what it, yeah, ontology, what exists and what doesn't, is the eddy in the stream or the whirlpool in the river. So you can walk to the riverbank and you can see quite a stable pattern there existing over time. It has, from one moment to the next, it looks quite similar. In fact, it's almost identical. It has an identity to it. That's kind of where that word comes from. Identicalness over time gives us an identity, right? But it isn't separate from the river. There's a helpful way we can label it and conceptualize it as something separate. It's boundaried. You can sort of see where the edges are, although it's soft and elastic as it sort of wobbles and shifts. But it is, yeah, indivisible from the rock that, and the water and the gravity and the hill and all of the conditions that created it. So you and me, we're eddies in a stream that we're relatively stable for a time as the conditions allow, as we have enough food and water and heat and warmth and love and all the other human needs. And as such, as those conditions are stable, we have an identity. We have identity over time. Break those things down, and quickly our identity will maybe change or completely disperse. The energy pattern in the universe, the spiraling form of energy, is stable enough, and so it's a little bit like that. Like on the one hand, foregrounding causes and conditions. On the other hand, like it is helpful to talk about eddies as being a thing that we can interact with. Like, don't get in the whirlpool in your raft because you're going to get stuck or dragged down. It's helpful to talk about whirlpools, right? When you're white water rafting. But what does this mean for when we're trying to not get too identified and too stuck? Well, one way of looking at it, this is essentially the core of the Buddhist path. It's not denying the self, but it's seeing the self as a whirlpool, as something that is not fixed and separate from the rest of the river, and not floating in the universe, separate from causes and conditions. That's basically the core insight. And that's so is the case for all other objects, ideas, frameworks, relationships. They are all they don't exist from their own side. They're always dependent on all the things that are going on. And so as the Buddhist path progresses, the progress of insight leads you to more and more to see, what I thought of as fixed and separate is not. That fundamental delusion is uprooted. And so are, therefore, lots of unwholesome behaviors that are predicated on that basic ignorance. And so over time, you become, I think, as another, a good teacher of my friend often says, like, talks about a Zen teaching story where the Zen master was asked, like, what is the result of a lifetime of practice? And the Zen master says, like, an appropriate response. Because by having less, fixedness in one's self-view and something to protect and defend because you think it's real and separate and needs that, you see a bit more clearly, you get a bit less biased, and have more degrees of freedom when it comes to deciding what is the most appropriate action now. less conditioned, less habituated. So there is in the Buddhist path, and I think in a skillful spiritual warrior path, where, whichever tradition you're practicing with, a movement towards seeing less and less like this is your thing. It's not, fewer things are me and mine, because you've seen through a basic ignorance there. So that's the overall trajectory, I would say, and it comes and it goes, and you need to have. It isn't just about being all is one and it doesn't matter whether I'm trampled on or whatever. But there's a kind of you need to have some backbone and some strength and some substance as well. I'm going on to a different point here. I think I'm
No,
ranting
no,
on.
but
I'll let you come back in.
yeah, but that's but I think all that tied together very nicely in terms of that initial question. And the like there's a beautiful, even how you described it there, it's almost like the fixedness, or the, when you look at an image and you can make it a little more transparent, it kind of feels a bit like that you're still aware of the existence of you, but you're just not seeing it as rigidly or as fixed or as important.
Mm.
Like there's an awareness almost of our interdependence. There's a humility almost in the inquiry.
Yes.
And with it, to me, it seems this flexibility, and this is a gorgeous expression, like an appropriate response.
Mm.
I think there's something in it that very much said to me, kind of, to be in the world but not of the world, and
Mm.
like some movement within this where, and I really appreciate as well just the oscillation that you say occurs with this. Like sometimes I even note when I'm writing something or even just sharing a perspective, I can notice that kind of irritable kind of friction sometimes when I'm trying to make something that is ours mine,
Mm-hmm. Mm.
and the joy or the freedom that, even if it's told from the like from my perspective, that I'm saying something that is more ours. And I think there is so much more freedom and playfulness in that.
Mm.
And it feels less kind of burdensome or even preaching, if you know what I mean. So
Mm-hmm.
I really like what you were pointing to there. Just
I
go
have
on.
something I'd love to jump
Yeah,
in
yeah,
with that
please.
I'm sort of excited about, and what you said. Like there is a need to be compassionate around that when you see that meanness and that contraction,
Yeah.
and there's a need to bring rigor and discipline. Like, and so there's this phrase like, as we develop our practice, we're both learning how to be strong in back, is sometimes how it's said, like giving you that uprightness and that sort of like what's the word that's often used? Yeah, I think it's uprightness, but like poise, uprightness, discipline, rigor, and soft in front. There's sort of like receptivity, caring, allowing, compassion, and just go like, oh, I really got caught up there, or like just in that moment. It's not a bad person. It's, of course, it's the human condition for me want to grab this whole. Yeah.
I adore this, and it's I think it's almost like because when you appreciate that compassion exists, or if you almost prove to some part of yourself or whatever that compassion exists, from my personal experience, I find that there's a greater willingness just to say things plainly. Like
Mm-hmm.
to myself now, I'm not saying that I earn the right to just have the same dialogue with myself that I would with everyone else. That's not always the most helpful. But I mean that I'm not afraid to look at what is, even if it could be considered that things have slipped, or I'm no longer, I've let things drift too much, because, as
Mm.
you say, it doesn't come with that added judgment of therefore bad person. It's just almost this compassion that exists in trying to see things as clearly as we can, knowing all the distortions that come into being able to see things clearly, but maybe even feeling things clearly. And I think once again, it's a beautiful paradox of an increased level. You could describe it as, as you say, straight backness, or even not strictness, and not, I don't even mean standard in the sense of a judgment again, but more of a felt experience of how did it feel, and yet a compassion that accompanies it. And as you say, like this predicament of being human is a hell of a one to
Tough
navigate,
business. Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
tough
It
business
is.
to be in.
Yeah.
Just, I'm looking at the time, and I'm aware that I maybe not have time to go into a few things that I maybe wanted to go into. But just when you mentioned earlier, just that role that you're experiencing in many different, even relationships with government and policy, you mentioned something earlier about, bringing things in through the hearts and mind and the culture, not just in terms of what's the outcome of policy. You also made reference to addressing things on a level of maybe being. What is your sense for our collective movement maybe into more wholesomeness? Like, do you hold an optimism for this? Is this quite an oscillating position for you, or how would you even describe it?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I mentioned earlier, this sort of um, acceptance or clear-eyedness about our fallenness,
Yeah.
and this sense of us being ultimately redeemable, I think is true in many different faith traditions. I mean, and I think there are many ways in which we have now evidence for that. Our cognitive biases, and predictable things that we fall into is just one example that's very, very evidence based. And we are also starting to see actually the sky is the limit. Like deep studies on, say, long-term meditators and monks, but also just quite short interventions on developing capacities of heart and mind, shifting mindset, worldviews. The deep stories that we're telling can make a huge difference. But we could put, in the grand scheme of things, we put almost no resource in that category of change, and we have a very myopic view of what progress looks like. And if you haven't got that developmental view, you don't realize that that's possible because you haven't seen it in your own heart, you haven't tried, or you haven't come across it, then I think looking at the polycrisis and the challenges that we're facing, you might naturally go into quite a dark direction. You'd be like, well, in the words of the dark MAGA stuff that's going on, like Peter Thiel and Elon Musk and Curtis Yarvin, people are too dumb to govern themselves. Like we need to basically take over and create techno-feudalism, authoritarian, fascist, city states. That's sort of what seems to be going on as far as my sense making can gather at the moment. Because if you look at how democracy is so really failing us in so many ways, isn't up to the complexity of the world we've created, and you don't have faith that humans can find affiliative patterns and the better angels of their nature to deal with complexity better, then maybe that's an obvious direction for your mind to go. I think the main challenge we can offer to that, the alternative view, is this possibility of deliberately developmental societies, and the evidence and the felt sense that we can be better, that we can practice something together to make democracy a developmental pathway, and not just think we got it or we haven't. It's baked, it's done. First past the post in the UK, which is terrible business in many ways, is like as good as it gets, But actually, we can find new and different ways, supported by technology of the heart and mind, psychotechnologies and digital technologies. A relative utopia really is possible, and the world is too dangerous for anything less than utopia, in the words of, I think, Buckminster Fuller. And so yeah, I think the possibility is there, but we really have to wake up to some of these completely neglected domains of efforting of intervention, of the fronts that we can fight on as spiritual warriors or whatever. And the other thing, so I mentioned the fact that being nice feels good. Like that's one thing that should give us hope. That ultimately, being selfish, meanness, contraction. If we're attentive, we see makes us actually suffer. Like we can enjoy the sensation of some of the things that come with that, the newness of new gadgets or tasty food or whatever. But actually, it's really outweighed by the contraction of the heart and mind that is required to prioritize that. It's one of the reasons why mindfulness on its own probably is a net positive, because just being aware of those fundamental mechanisms of suffering should incline us in that direction. But the other thing is that our values are in a kind of hierarchy if we pay attention, and that it's played out in our media and our culture, our films as well. Like we can value pleasantness and unpleasantness, but it's probably like the most base value. Above that, you have like utility, when things are kind of like useful to us or useless. Like that often like feels in some ways slightly more refined, slightly higher value than pleasant and unpleasant. Like it feels really quite good when I've got the right tool for the job, and if everything's like, that's just one example. And then above that, there are other values which get more and more precarious. Like the one that will always be there, I guess, is pleasant and unpleasant. As they get higher, they get a little bit more precarious, a little bit more abstract, but in some way worth going to. They're more refined, they're more pleasant, and as people will lose their lives for them. So just the value of self-sacrifice over self-serving is a value that we like to see play out in our films and in our novels, because there's something higher about it. This person overcame their base impulses, and the Greeks were down with this, like, what is a good life? How do we move away from base impulses to something that is higher? And the work of Nikolai Hartmann, who's a kind of phenomenological or experiential value philosopher, and others, started this inquiry about how actually you can directly look at and feel how some things feel higher than others, just feel like they're worth aligning to and sacrificing lower values. And this seems to be, as far as the inquiries that I've gone on in philosophy and sort of contemplative practices, it seems to be fairly universal, this kind of hierarchy. And you have religious values, or that are often about self-transcendence and something about being generative and something bigger than ourselves, feel in some way exalted relative to these others. So yeah, these two things, that being nice feels good, and that there seems to be something in our being, some kind of structure that is discernible, that leads us to a better place.
This is, I was about to say this is glorious, and then I also thought that, well, this just very aligns with my own views, so maybe that's just very convenient.
Right, yeah. I'm very happy to validate you this morning.
Yeah, wonderful.
I'm delighted.
No, but I think this is, this thing that you're pointing to, I don't think that this, while we've attempted to put words to this and maybe put it, carve it out on in stone at different times, and therefore we've made it almost this external idea, or this mental idea of goodness, or why we would be good. It takes away from what the felt experience of it is like. And once again, it won't lead to, in my case anyway, it doesn't lead to absolute purity. I'm not trying to pretend that. And yet there's a sincerity that I think comes with it, that even if there are moments where meanness has kicked in or whatever it might be, that there can be a very quick awareness of that, or an acknowledgement of that. And so going back to this idea that you had of being human beings being redeemable, I think that's massively important. And I'm just like looking, I guess, at, from what we were discussing in this conversation around, what am I practicing? This moving into a relationship with ourselves, which feels very different. This noticing in our lives of moments where what did that actually feel like? This very simple idea, even just of generosity, like these things just get spoken in such disingenuous ways. I find that sometimes we lose the idea of their magic and power. This desire then to almost share that experience with the world outside of you, a focus or an intention really around a sense of being a spiritual warrior in your own life, going that changing your work experience as well, or your expression in your work, then even acknowledging within that this oscillation sometimes between what's mine and ours, and noticing that, even noticing with intentions what's mine or ours, and the difference that can have in life. And even just this, these very, and in some ways basic tenets of being nice feels good, and then this maybe expansion or hierarchy of values that as we continue to feel and sense in life, that we can start to pay attention just to what actually makes us feel, what gives us a better relationship with ourselves, with others, and the world around us. There's been so many, I think, really fundamentally important parts or fundamental components of a good life that you've been touching on. But I'd love to ask you the question, Jamie, of what is a good life for you?
Yeah. It feels like, I guess, that has also been a question I've been asking myself in parallel to that practicing. I guess maybe that's more the fundamental question, perhaps beneath that practice question. I don't know. Yeah, I think it is to recognize the great gift we have been given in the fact of existence, but also in all of the previous innovators, transformers, healers. People have been working really hard to make things a little bit better, to make their suffering potentially mean something, to help other people avoid that same suffering, to build, to create, to make it more beautiful. Like, I don't think we give that enough credit. We often look at the bad things in our world and not go like, holy moly, there have been countless millions of people who have really tried to orientate towards wholesomeness and make things a little bit better, at the same time as falling into the same traps all of us do, to recognize the gift in that, and to think, I want to be part of it. I want to be part of this project of making things a bit better with whatever I have to hand. It'll look very different to very different people depending on, the resources or knowledge or whatever it is that you have available. But can I more of the time contribute to wholesomeness and generativity, and less unwholesomeness and degenerative functions, which we will do, which we will fall into. Yeah. I think that's it.
Jamie, look, thank you so much for joining us today on the What is a Good Life podcast. Just what you said there too, I would also echo that, and add that so much of life, when you start to pay attention to so many of the things that you've noticed, an aliveness or a connection with life and the world around us, I think, are almost natural extensions of what you're pointing to, and it kind of can take us out of somewhat of just the outcome driven focus of this life. And it's not to say that you will not be wildly successful in terms of what society currently values, or you may lose it all. It's not about that. It's literally just, there's a quality of life, or there's an experience of life, that when you start paying attention to so many of the things you notice, that I think it has a transformative effect on the being or our felt experience of life. And so for all that you've shared and everything else, Jenny, thanks a million for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Mark. Yeah, what a wonderful opportunity. I really enjoyed this conversation, and good luck with the rest of the inquiry. What a valuable thing.